In the coastal low country of South Carolina, there are places where the earth itself seems to remember, where the soil holds secrets that no amount of rain can wash away, and where certain truths lay buried beneath layers of clay and time. It was in the spring of 1847 that city surveyors began documenting something defying every natural law they understood. Spanning 7 different plantations across the low country, from the Ashley River to the Cooper, from the Sea Islands to the inland swamps, they discovered slave quarters sharing an impossible characteristic. No rats nested within their walls. No snakes slithered beneath their floors. No insects crawled through the cracks in their foundations. These structures stood empty of vermin, as if nature itself had drawn a boundary no creature would cross. The surveyors noted this peculiarity in their official reports, but those documents were quietly filed away, stamped with a seal reading, administrative review pending, and never saw public light. What the city officials discovered in those quarters was deemed too disturbing, too politically volatile for the fragile peace of the antebellum South. But the truth has a way of surfacing, even when buried deep. And the story of what really happened in those buildings, what connected them all, what kept the animals away, and what it cost the people forced to live within those walls, reveals something far more chilling than any supernatural tale ever could. Before we continue with the story of Charleston's silent quarters and the surveyor who refused to let the truth stay buried, I need you to do something. If you're fascinated by real historical mysteries that blur the line between documented fact and unsettling truth, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel digs into the darkest corners of American history, the stories that were deliberately forgotten, the truths that powerful people wanted erased. And I want to know, where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments. Let's see how far these forgotten stories can reach. Now, let's return to Charleston, 1847, and meet the men who would spend 3 years of his life unraveling a mystery that would haunt him until his final breath. Charleston in 1847 was a city of contradictions, a place where immense wealth existed alongside profound suffering, where grand mansions with their piazzas and gardens stood within sight of the auction blocks where human beings were bought and sold. The city had grown prosperous on rice, indigo, and cotton, prosperity that had created an aristocracy priding itself on refinement, education, and what they called civilization. The streets were paved with ballast stones brought from distant ports. Gas lamps illuminated the main thoroughfares. The bells of St. Michael's Church rang out over a city considering itself the jewel of the South. But beneath this veneer of gentility lay a system of brutal exploitation. The low-country plantations surrounding Charleston were among the most profitable in the nation and also among the most deadly. The rice fields with their standing water and malarial mosquitoes killed enslaved workers at rates shocking even hardened overseers. The task system used in the region was considered more humane than the gang labor of the cotton plantations further inland, but it was still a system built on the theft of human freedom, on families torn apart, on lives measured only by their economic value. Into this world came Elias Vance, a surveyor and civil engineer from Philadelphia. He was 32 years old in the spring of 1847, a man of medium height with dark hair already beginning to gray at the temples and eyes that colleagues described as unsettlingly observant. Vance had studied at the University of Pennsylvania under some of the finest scientific minds of his generation. He had learned not just the practical skills of surveying, the use of theodolites and chains, the calculation of angles and distances, but also geology, chemistry, and what was then called natural philosophy. He approached the world with a scientist's skepticism and a reformer's conscience. Vance had come to Charleston reluctantly. His firm in Philadelphia had secured a contract with the city to conduct a comprehensive survey of properties in the surrounding low country. The work was meant to establish clear boundaries for tax purposes, to settle disputes between neighboring plantations, and to create accurate maps for a region settled piecemeal over more than a century. It was routine work, the kind that paid well but offered little intellectual stimulation. Vance had accepted the assignment primarily because he needed the money. His father had died the previous year, leaving debts that Elias felt honor-bound to settle. He arrived in Charleston on a humid April morning when the city was fragrant with the scent of Confederate jasmine and the harbor was crowded with ships from around the world. He took lodgings in a boarding house on Church Street, run by a widow named Mrs. Talbert, who was known for maintaining a respectable establishment and asking few questions of her tenants. The room was small but clean, with a window overlooking a garden where camellias bloomed in profusion. Vance's first weeks in Charleston were spent in the city offices reviewing existing property records and maps. The documents were a mess, some dating back to the original colonial land grants, others hastily drawn during property transfers, many contradicting each other in significant ways. He quickly realized the survey would take far longer than his firm had estimated. But he was a methodical man, and he set about organizing the chaos with the same careful attention he brought to all his work. It was during this preliminary research that he first encountered mention of the silent quarters. The reference appeared in a report filed by a city health inspector named Thomas Gadsden in 1843. Gadsden had been investigating an outbreak of fever on several plantations and had noted almost as an aside that certain slave quarters seemed remarkably free of the usual vermin and pestilence. He had attributed this to superior construction or perhaps the particular composition of the soil but had not investigated further. The comment was buried in a lengthy report filled with statistics about mortality rates and recommendations for drainage improvements. Vance might have overlooked it entirely except that he found two more references in subsequent years. Another inspector had noted the same phenomenon at a different plantation. Then a surveyor's report from 1846 mentioned that the slave quarters at the Middleton plantation had no evidence of rat infestation, unlike every other structure on the property. Each time the observation was treated as a curiosity, nothing more. But Vance's scientific training had taught him to pay attention to patterns, to anomalies that repeated themselves. And there was something about these reports that troubled him. In his experience, slave quarters were invariably infested with vermin. The structures were poorly built with gaps in the walls and floors providing easy access for rats and snakes. The inhabitants had few resources to fight infestations. Food scraps and waste attracted pests. It was one of the many cruelties of the system that people were forced to live in conditions considered intolerable for livestock. So how could multiple quarters across different plantations be free of vermin? What could possibly explain such a consistent anomaly? Vance decided to investigate. It would mean deviating from his assigned work, spending time on something bearing no relation to property boundaries or tax assessments, but his curiosity was aroused, and he had never been good at ignoring questions demanding answers. He began by requesting permission to visit the plantations mentioned in the reports. This proved more difficult than he had anticipated. Plantation owners in the Charleston Low Country were suspicious of outsiders, particularly Northerners, especially those asking too many questions about the living conditions of enslaved people. The political tensions between North and South were already running high in 1847. The Mexican-American War was underway, and the question of whether new territories would permit slavery was inflaming passions on both sides. Abolition was a word that could end a conversation or start a fight. But Vance had his official credentials as a surveyor, and he framed his requests in terms of his assigned work. He needed to survey property boundaries, he explained, and that required walking the entire extent of each plantation, including the areas where the quarters were located. Most owners granted permission, though often with conditions. He was to be accompanied by an overseer. He was not to speak with the enslaved people. He was to conduct his work quickly and leave. The first plantation he visited was called Riverside, located about 15 miles up the Ashley River from Charleston. It was a rice plantation, one of the most profitable in the region, owned by a man named Nathaniel Drayton. The main house was a magnificent structure of brick and stucco surrounded by live oaks draped with Spanish moss. The rice fields stretched for hundreds of acres, divided by a complex system of dikes and canals allowing the fields to be flooded and drained according to the needs of the crop. The slave quarters at Riverside were located about a quarter mile from the main house, a row of small wooden structures housing nearly 200 people. Vance was accompanied by the plantation's head overseer, a man named Cyrus Holt, who made no effort to hide his contempt for the surveyor's interest in the Negro houses. "They're just shacks," Holt said as they walked toward the quarters. "Built cheap, fall apart every few years, we put up new ones. Nothing special about them." But as they approached, Vance noticed something making him slow his pace. The quarters were indeed crude structures, single-room buildings with palmetto-thatched roofs and walls made of rough-hewn boards, but they were silent in a way seeming unnatural. There were no sounds of scurrying in the walls, no rustle of movement beneath the floors. And more striking still, there were no snakes sunning themselves on the wooden steps, no rat droppings visible in the dirt around the foundations. Vance asked permission to enter one of the quarters. Holt shrugged and opened the door to a building currently unoccupied, its inhabitants in the fields. The interior was dim and spare, a few rough pallets on the floor, a small fireplace, some cooking implements. The air smelled of smoke and sweat and the particular mustiness of old wood, but there was no evidence of vermin. No holes gnawed in the walls, no nests in the corners, no snakeskins shed in the rafters. "You see," Holt said. "Nothing here. Can we get on with the real work?" But Vance was examining the walls, running his hands over the rough boards. And then he noticed something. The gaps between the boards had been filled with a gray clay, packed in tightly to seal the cracks. This was not unusual in itself, many structures used clay chinking to keep out drafts and rain. But this clay had a particular texture, almost greasy to the touch, and a faint smell he couldn't quite identify. Something mineral, something reminding him of the smell of a blacksmith's forge. "Where did this clay come from?" he asked. Holt looked at him as if he'd asked the color of the sky. "From the ground, I expect. There's clay all over this property. The Negroes dig it up and use it for chinking, for making bricks, for whatever they need." "But from where specifically? Which part of the property?" Holt's expression shifted from contempt to irritation. "How the hell should I know? You'd have to ask them, and I'm not about to waste my time translating questions about dirt." Vance made a note in his surveying book. Then he asked if he could take a sample of the clay. Holt shrugged again. What possible interest could a surveyor have in clay? And Vance carefully scraped some of the material into a small glass vial he carried for soil samples. Over the next 3 weeks, Vance visited 6 more plantations where the reports had mentioned quarters free of vermin. Each time he found the same thing, structures silent and empty of pests, and walls chinked with a particular gray clay. The clay was always the same, that greasy texture, that faint metallic smell. And each time he asked about its source, he received vague answers. It came from somewhere on the property. The enslaved people knew where to find it. The overseers and owners had never paid attention to such details. But Vance was beginning to form a hypothesis. The clay was keeping the vermin away. Something in its composition, some mineral content, some chemical property was acting as a natural repellent. It was an interesting discovery from a scientific standpoint, but it raised troubling questions. If the clay repelled rats and snakes, what effect might it have on the people living in constant proximity to it? Were there health consequences no one had considered? He decided he needed to analyze the clay properly using the chemical techniques he had learned at university. But Charleston had limited scientific facilities, and he didn't trust the local authorities with his findings. Not yet. Not until he understood what he was dealing with. So he wrote to a colleague in Philadelphia, a chemist named Dr. Alastair Finch, and sent him samples of the clay along with a detailed description of where it had been found and under what circumstances. Then he waited. Mail between Charleston and Philadelphia took at least a week in each direction, and he knew a proper chemical analysis would take time. In the meanwhile, he continued his official surveying work, but his mind kept returning to the silent quarters and the strange gray clay. It was during this waiting period that Vance first spoke with someone who had actually lived in one of the quarters. Her name was Era, though she was known to everyone as "ma'am," a term of respect acknowledging her age and the authority she held within the enslaved community. She was perhaps 60 years old, though she looked older, her face deeply lined and her hair completely white. She had been born into slavery on one of the Sea Island plantations and had spent her entire life in the Low Country. She was currently living at a plantation called Oakwood, where Vance had come to survey a disputed property line. He encountered her by chance, or perhaps by her design. He had been working alone that day, the overseer had been called away to deal with some emergency in the fields, and he was taking measurements near the quarters when Era approached him. She moved slowly, leaning on a walking stick, but her eyes were sharp and assessing. "You're the men been asking about the quiet houses," she said. It was not a question. Vance was startled. He had been careful to frame his inquiries in neutral terms to avoid drawing attention to his real interest. But apparently word had spread through the network of communication existing among the enslaved people, invisible to their owners but remarkably efficient. I'm a surveyor, he said carefully. I've noticed that some of the quarters seem to be free of vermin, and I'm curious about why. Era studied him for a long moment. Then she said, "You got the look of a man who wants to know things. But knowing things can be dangerous, especially for a white man asking questions about how we live." "I mean no harm," Vance said. "I'm simply trying to understand." "Understand what?" "Why the rats don't come. Why the snakes stay away." She shook her head slowly. "Those houses are quiet because of the mud. The gray mud from the bad place. We've been using it for years because it keeps the vermin out. And Lord knows we got enough troubles without rats eating our food and snakes biting our children." "The bad place?" Vance asked. "What do you mean?" Era glanced around, checking that they were truly alone. Then she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "There's a swamp about 3 miles inland from here. The old people call it the Whispering Earth. The mud there is different. Gray and heavy. And it smells like metal. Animals won't go near it. Birds don't fly over it. Even the mosquitoes stay away. We learned a long time ago that if you pack that mud into the walls of a house, the vermin won't come in. So we use it. We walk 3 miles to dig it up. We carry it back in buckets. We pack it into every crack and gap. Because a house without rats is a blessing, even if," she trailed off, and Vance saw something in her expression chilling him. Fear and something else, resignation, perhaps. The look of someone knowing a terrible truth but having no power to change it. "Even if what?" he prompted gently. Era was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Even if the people who live in those houses get sick. Even if they get weak and tired, if their bones ache, if their teeth fall out, if they waste away for no reason the doctors can name. We know the mud is bad for us. We've known it for years. But we use it anyway because the choice is between slow sickness and rats that spread fever, snakes that kill children, insects that make life unbearable. We choose the slow sickness. We don't have the luxury of choosing health." Vance felt something twist in his chest. "How long have people been using this mud?" "Long as I can remember," Era said. "My grandmother used it. Her mother before her. It's been going on since the first quarters were built on these plantations, maybe longer. The white folks never noticed, never cared. Why would they? They don't live in those houses. They don't breathe that dust every day. They don't watch their children grow up weak and sick." "Where exactly is this swamp?" Vance asked. "The Whispering Earth." Era gave him directions, a complex set of landmarks involving old trees, abandoned rice fields, and paths not marked on any map. Then she said, "You going to go there?" "Yes," Vance said. "I need to see it for myself. I need to understand what's in that mud." "And then what?" Era asked. "Say you figure it out. Say you learn that the mud is poison, that it's been killing us slow for generations. What are you going to do with that knowledge? You think the masters will care? You think they'll tear down the quarters and build new ones with clean materials? Or will they just find a new way to save money, a new way to make us suffer?" Vance had no answer to that. He wanted to believe that knowledge would lead to change, that exposing the truth would force people to act. But he was not naive. He knew the power structures of the South, knew how little value was placed on the lives of enslaved people. "I don't know what will happen," he said finally. "But I have to try. I have to document what I find. Maybe it won't change anything now. But someday, when this system finally ends, and it will end, it must end, maybe this information will matter. Maybe it will be part of the accounting, part of the record of what was done to your people." Era looked at him with an expression that might have been pity. "You're a good man, I think. But good men don't change the world. Power changes the world. And you don't have any power here." She turned and walked away, leaning heavily on her stick, leaving Vance standing alone with his surveying equipment and his growing sense of dread. The Whispering Earth was not marked on any map Vance had seen. Following Era's directions, he set out early one morning in late May, when the heat was already oppressive and the air thick with humidity. He told Mrs. Talbert that he would be gone for the day conducting field surveys, and he packed water, some bread and cheese, his surveying tools, and several glass vials for collecting samples. The journey took him inland, away from the plantations and into the wild low country existing between the cultivated fields. This was a landscape of dense maritime forest, palmetto thickets, and swamps where the water was the color of tea from the tannins leached out of decaying vegetation. The paths were narrow and often flooded, and Vance found himself wading through water coming up to his knees, his boots squelching in the mud. He had been walking for nearly 2 hours when he noticed the change. The forest around him had grown quieter. The constant background noise of birds and insects had faded to near silence. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the air still and heavy. And there was a smell, faint at first but growing stronger as he continued, that same metallic odor he had noticed in the clay samples, but more intense, almost overwhelming. Then he saw it, the swamp Era had called the Whispering Earth. It was perhaps 2 acres in extent, a depression in the landscape where water had pooled and stagnated, but the water was not the dark tea color of normal swamp water. It was gray, almost milky, with an oily sheen on its surface. The trees around the edges were dead or dying, their bark peeling away to reveal pale wood beneath. And the ground at the water's edge was covered with the gray clay, exposed where the water level had dropped during the dry season. Vance approached slowly, every instinct telling him this was a place of danger. He could see no animals, no birds in the trees, no turtles sunning on logs, no fish breaking the surface of the water. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the squelch of his boots in the mud. He knelt at the edge of the swamp and examined the clay. It was exactly like the samples he had collected from the quarters, that same greasy texture, that same metallic smell. He filled several vials with the material, being careful not to let it touch his skin more than necessary. Then he took out a small notebook and began to sketch the area, noting the dead trees, the color of the water, the absence of life. As he worked, he became aware of a sound. It was very faint, almost at the edge of hearing, a kind of whisper or hiss seeming to come from the swamp itself. He realized it was the sound of gas bubbles rising through the water and bursting at the surface, releasing whatever compounds were trapped in the sediment below. It was a natural phenomenon, but in the eerie silence of the place, it sounded almost like voices, like the earth itself was speaking in a language he couldn't understand. The Whispering Earth. Now he understood the name. He spent perhaps an hour at the swamp collecting samples and making observations. Then, as the sun climbed higher and the heat became unbearable, he began the long walk back to Charleston. His mind was racing with possibilities. What was in that clay? What mineral or chemical gave it those properties, the ability to repel animals, the greasy texture, the metallic smell? And most importantly, what effect did it have on human health? He thought of Era's words, * the people who live in those houses get sick. They get weak and tired. Their bones ache. Their teeth fall out, * those were symptoms of something, some kind of poisoning or deficiency. But what? When he returned to his boarding house that evening, exhausted and covered in mud, he found a letter waiting for him. It was from Dr. Alastair Finch in Philadelphia, responding to the clay samples Vance had sent weeks earlier. Vance tore open the envelope with shaking hands and read, "My dear Vance. I have completed my analysis of the clay samples you sent, and I must confess that the results are both fascinating and deeply troubling. The material contains extraordinarily high concentrations of several heavy metals, most notably lead, arsenic, and mercury. The lead content alone is sufficient to explain the absence of vermin. Rats and snakes are highly sensitive to lead poisoning and will avoid areas where it is present in the environment, **. However, I must stress that these same properties make the clay extremely dangerous to human health. Chronic exposure to lead causes a constellation of symptoms including fatigue, weakness, abdominal pain, cognitive impairment, and in severe cases, death. Arsenic and mercury have similar effects. If people are living in structures where this clay has been used extensively, they are essentially being poisoned slowly over the course of years or decades, **. The source of these metals is likely geological. There must be some mineral deposit in the area where the clay is found that is leaching these compounds into the soil and water. Such deposits are not uncommon in coastal regions, but they are usually avoided for habitation precisely because of their toxic properties. I urge you to bring this matter to the attention of the relevant authorities immediately. If what you describe is accurate, that this clay has been used in the construction of housing for enslaved people across multiple plantations, then we are looking at a public health crisis of significant proportions. Please write to me with any further developments. I remain your colleague and friend, Dr. Alastair Finch. Vance read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling. He had suspected the clay was harmful, but the reality was worse than he had imagined. Lead, arsenic, mercury, these were poisons, pure and simple. And people had been living with them, breathing the dust, touching the walls, for generations. He thought of the children growing up in those quarters, their developing brains and bodies exposed to neurotoxins from their first breath. He thought of the women and men who had no choice but to live in those structures, who had chosen the slow death of poisoning over the immediate threat of vermin. He thought of Era's words, "We don't have the luxury of choosing health." And he knew he had to do something. He had to document this. Had to bring it to light. Had to force someone to acknowledge what was happening. But who would listen? Who would care? The next morning, Vance went to the Charleston city offices with Dr. Finch's letter and his own detailed notes. He requested a meeting with the city health officer, a man named Dr. Samuel Priolo, who was responsible for monitoring disease outbreaks and sanitary conditions in the city and surrounding areas. Dr. Priolo was a Charleston native, a man in his 50s with the refined manners and accent of the local aristocracy. He received Vance in his office, a room lined with medical texts and anatomical charts, and listened politely as the surveyor explained his findings. When Vance finished, Dr. Priolo was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Mr. Vance, I appreciate your diligence in bringing this matter to my attention. However, I must point out several issues with your conclusions." "Issues?" Vance said, struggling to keep his voice level. "Dr. Finch's analysis is quite clear. The clay contains dangerous levels of heavy metals. People are being poisoned." "Dr. Finch is a respected chemist, I'm sure," Priolo said smoothly. "But he is analyzing samples in a laboratory in Philadelphia, far removed from the actual conditions here. He does not understand the constitution of the Negro, which is fundamentally different from that of the white men. What might be harmful to us may have little effect on them. They are adapted to this climate, to these conditions, in ways that we are not." Vance stared at him in disbelief. "That's not how chemistry works. Lead is lead. It doesn't discriminate based on race." "I'm afraid you're mistaken," Priolo said, his tone becoming cooler. "There is extensive medical literature on the differences between the races. The Negro has a thicker skin, a different blood composition, a greater tolerance for heat and disease. These are established scientific facts." "They're not facts," Vance said, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain calm. "They're justifications, excuses for treating people as less than human." Priolo's expression hardened. "Mr. Vance, I understand that you come from Philadelphia, where certain progressive ideas are fashionable, but you are in Charleston now, and you would do well to remember that the institution of slavery is the foundation of our economy and our society. It is protected by law and by custom, and I will not allow unfounded accusations about the health conditions of slave quarters to be used as ammunition by abolitionists and troublemakers." "These aren't unfounded accusations," Vance said. "I have chemical analysis. I have samples. I have testimony from people who have lived in these quarters and watched their families sicken and die." "Testimony from slaves," Priolo said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Slaves who would say anything to cause trouble for their masters. That's your evidence." Vance realized he was getting nowhere. Priolo had no interest in the truth. He was part of the system, benefiting from it, and he would defend it against any challenge, no matter how well documented. "I see," Vance said quietly. "Thank you for your time, Dr. Priolo." He left the office feeling a mixture of rage and despair. He had been naive to think presenting the facts would be enough. The people in power didn't want to know the truth. They wanted to maintain the status quo, to protect their wealth and their way of life, no matter the human cost. But Vance was not ready to give up. If the local authorities wouldn't act, perhaps he could find other avenues. He wrote to abolitionist newspapers in the North detailing his findings. He wrote to medical journals hoping Dr. Finch's analysis would be published and discussed. He wrote to members of Congress known to oppose slavery, providing them with documentation that could be used in debates. And he continued his investigation. If he was going to expose this crime, and he had come to think of it as a crime, a deliberate poisoning of innocent people, then he needed more than just chemical analysis. He needed to document the human cost, to show the world what this poisoning looked like in real terms. He began visiting plantations again, but this time he sought out the enslaved people themselves, speaking to them when overseers weren't watching, asking about their health, their families, their experiences living in the quarters. It was dangerous work. If he was caught, he could be run off the plantations, or worse. But he was driven by a sense of moral urgency overriding his caution. What he learned was heartbreaking. Story after story of children dying young, of adults losing their strength and vitality in their 30s, of mysterious ailments doctors couldn't explain or treat. He heard about the chronic pain many people suffered, the weakness in their limbs, the confusion and memory loss coming over them. He heard about miscarriages and stillbirths, about children born with deformities or developmental delays. And in every case, the pattern was the same. The symptoms were worst in people who had lived their entire lives in quarters chinked with the gray clay. Those moved to different quarters or who had spent time away from the plantations often showed some improvement. It was a clear dose-response relationship, exactly what you would expect from chronic poisoning. Vance documented everything meticulously. He created charts showing the correlation between time spent in the contaminated quarters and the severity of symptoms. He collected testimonies, though he had to be careful about how he recorded them. He couldn't use real names, couldn't identify specific plantations, because that would put his informants at risk of retaliation. As the summer of 1847 turned to fall, Vance became increasingly consumed by his investigation. He neglected his official surveying work, spending his days tracking down leads and his nights writing up his findings. Mrs. Talbert began to worry about him. He was losing weight, sleeping poorly, becoming withdrawn and obsessive. And he was being watched. He didn't realize it at first, but the plantation owners had taken note of his activities, a northern surveyor spending too much time talking to slaves, asking too many questions about their living conditions, seeming to have an agenda beyond his official duties. This was suspicious, potentially dangerous. In October, Vance received a visit from a man named Richard Wentworth, who introduced himself as a representative of the Charleston Planters Association. Wentworth was in his 40s, impeccably dressed, with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to power. "Mr. Vance," he said, settling into a chair in the boarding house parlor. "I understand you've been conducting some kind of investigation into the slave quarters on various plantations." "I'm a surveyor," Vance said carefully. "I'm conducting the survey I was contracted to do." "Come now," Wentworth said with a thin smile. "Let's not play games. We know you've been asking questions about health conditions, collecting samples of building materials, corresponding with abolitionists in the North. We know you've been speaking with slaves without permission from their owners. These are serious matters, Mr. Vance." "I've discovered a serious public health issue," Vance said. "The clay being used in the construction of slave quarters contains dangerous levels of heavy metals. People are being poisoned." "So I've heard," Wentworth said. "And I'm here to tell you that your investigation is over. You will cease all inquiries into this matter. You will destroy any documents you've created. And you will leave Charleston within the week." "I will do no such thing," Vance said, his voice shaking with anger. "What's happening here is a crime. People are dying because of negligence and greed. People are dying because they are slaves," Wentworth said flatly. "They are property, Mr. Vance. They have no rights, no legal standing. And you, as a visitor to this city, have no authority to interfere in how property is managed." "They're human beings," Vance said. "That is a matter of opinion," Wentworth replied. And it is not an opinion shared by the laws of South Carolina or the United States. Now, I've been polite, Mr. Vance, because I understand that you're simply misguided, that you've been influenced by the radical ideas so fashionable in Philadelphia. But my patience has limits. If you continue with this investigation, if you publish your findings or share them with abolitionist agitators, there will be consequences. Your surveying contract will be terminated. Your reputation will be destroyed. And you may find that Charleston is not a safe place for you. It was a threat, barely veiled. Vance felt a chill run down his spine, but he forced himself to meet Wentworth's eyes. "I'm not afraid of you." "Then you're a fool," Wentworth said. He stood, adjusting his coat. "You have 1 week, Mr. Vance. I suggest you use it wisely." After Wentworth left, Vance sat alone in the parlor, his mind racing. He was in danger. That much was clear. But he couldn't simply abandon his investigation. He couldn't let this crime go unexposed. He thought of Era, of all the people he had spoken with, of the children growing up in those poison quarters. He owed them something. He owed them the truth. But he also had to be realistic. If he stayed in Charleston, he would likely be silenced one way or another. His documents would be seized or destroyed. He might be arrested on some trumped-up charge, or simply disappear one night, another victim of the violence lurking beneath the surface of Southern gentility. He needed to get his findings out of Charleston, to somewhere they would be safe, where they could be published and disseminated. And he needed to do it quickly, before Wentworth's deadline expired. He spent the next 3 days working frantically, making multiple copies of all his documents, his notes, his maps, his chemical analyses, his testimonies. He packed them into several parcels, addressing them to different people: Dr. Finch in Philadelphia, an abolitionist newspaper editor in Boston, a congressman in Washington. He took the parcels to different post offices and shipping companies, spreading them out so that if one was intercepted, the others might still get through. Then, on the 6th day after Wentworth's visit, he left Charleston. He told Mrs. Talbert he was going to Savannah for a few days to consult with colleagues. He took only a small bag with him, leaving most of his possessions behind, and he boarded a northbound train, watching the city recede into the distance with a mixture of relief and regret. He had failed to change anything in Charleston. The quarters would continue to poison their inhabitants. The plantation owners would continue to profit from their suffering. The authorities would continue to look the other way. But he had documented the truth. And someday, he believed, that truth would matter. Vance returned to Philadelphia in November of 1847, physically and emotionally exhausted. He had lost nearly 20 pounds during his time in Charleston, and he suffered from nightmares leaving him gasping awake in the darkness, his sheets soaked with sweat. In his dreams, he walked through endless rows of silent quarters, their walls oozing with gray clay while ghostly figures watched him with accusing eyes. Dr. Finch was shocked by his friend's appearance. "My God, Elias," he said when they met at a coffee house near the university. "What happened to you down there?" Vance told him everything. The investigation, the discoveries, the threats, the flight from Charleston. Finch listened with growing horror. "We have to publish this," Finch said when Vance finished. "We have to get this information out to the public." "I've tried," Vance said wearily. "I sent copies of my findings to newspapers, to medical journals, to politicians. Most haven't responded. Those that have, they're not interested. The northern papers say it's too inflammatory, that it will be dismissed as abolitionist propaganda. The medical journals say they need more rigorous scientific evidence, that testimonies from slaves aren't reliable data. The politicians say they can't act without official reports from local authorities. And we both know those authorities will never acknowledge the problem. So what do we do?" Finch asked. "I don't know," Vance admitted. "I feel like I'm shouting into a void. I have the truth. I have the evidence. But no one wants to hear it." But Finch was not ready to give up. He was a member of the American Philosophical Society, one of the oldest and most prestigious scientific organizations in the country. He proposed that Vance present his findings at one of the society's meetings, framing it as a case study in environmental toxicology rather than a political statement about slavery. Vance agreed, though he was skeptical about what it would accomplish. He spent the next several weeks preparing a formal presentation, complete with chemical analyses, maps, and statistical data. He deliberately downplayed the human element, focusing instead on the scientific aspects, the composition of the clay, the mechanism by which heavy metals leach into the environment, the dose-response relationships in chronic poisoning. The presentation took place on a cold evening in January of 1848. The audience consisted of about 30 people, professors, physicians, chemists, and other members of the scientific community. Vance spoke for nearly an hour, his voice steady despite his nervousness, presenting his findings with the same careful precision he had used in his surveying work. When he finished, there was a long silence. Then the questions began. "How can you be certain that the symptoms you describe are caused by the clay and not by other factors?" one physician asked. "Slaves live in conditions of extreme hardship. They suffer from malnutrition, overwork, exposure to disease. Any of these could explain the health problems you observed." "I accounted for those factors," Vance said. "I compared health outcomes between people living in quarters with the contaminated clay and those living in quarters without it, controlling for other variables as much as possible. The correlation is clear and consistent." "But your sample size is small," another scientist objected, "and your data collection."